We're going to get started now at 3:05. Just know that this session is being recorded for our own purposes, but we won't be sharing this session with anyone beyond our enrolled students. So of course, as I said over multiple emails, the purpose of today's session is to really talk about coronavirus and how that's really impacted college admissions. We're going to be throwing a lot of information at everyone, so don't feel bad if something's going too quick. If you do have questions, you simply chat me. So if you go down to your Zoom screen, whether you're on a computer or phone, it should look pretty similar. If you go down to your screen, there should be a tab with a bunch of different options. One of them is the chat option. So if you click on the chat option, you should be able to message me. So throughout the presentation, if you have questions about anything or something isn't making sense, just feel free to chat me. You could also just raise your hand or if you have your video on, but I see that not everyone does. So it's totally okay to raise your hand on the platform as well. You could do this by going to the participants list and raising your hand using the little raise hand feature. But any of those options are fine. I may reserve, even if you chat with a question, I may reserve answering questions until the very end, just so that we don't disrupt the presentation, because I think a lot of the presentation will answer the most frequently asked questions. One last disclaimer I'll give before we get started is that obviously this is a developing situation. We don't know how coronavirus is going to proceed into the fall, whether we're still going to be social distancing, whether it's going to get better, get worse. So if things drastically change, we'll update everyone with as needed. But the presentation that we're about to give is basically based on all the information that we have currently and we think is going to happen based on the current spread. Okay, so let me just share my screen with everyone so people can see. Okay, so everyone can see the screen, correct? Okay, I think everyone's going to see. I am going to, for now, mute everyone just so that everyone can hear me and we don't have weird background noise. But again, if you have questions, feel free to ask on the chat or raise your hand feature. And I'll do my best to get to everyone. And if I don't get to you during the presentation, I'll definitely reserve as much time as we need to get to it after the presentation. So it goes without saying that this is a very weird cycle. We've really never had anything like this happen in terms of American admissions. Like we've had other very serious events, like with 9/11 and that impacting admissions. SARS kind of briefly impacted admissions, but nothing like this to this level, especially at a time where admissions has become a lot more globalized. Like we're getting a lot more international students than we have, decades and years ago. So there are a lot of changes. I'm going to first start talking about the changes in terms of like what we expect to be changed from the admission standpoint in terms of the metrics that people use for admissions. The first and foremost is, of course, test scores. As I'm sure pretty much everyone on this chat has experienced for themselves, a bunch of tests have been canceled, postponed, or changed in some ways. The first section, we're really talking about SATs, SAT2s, and ACTs. APs have been changed, but that affects admissions way less. And so that's a little bit different that I'll talk about in the end. But first and foremost, we're really talking about the SAT, SAT2s, and ACTs. So yes, a lot of them have been canceled. We have been told by the College Board, who are the makers of the SATs, as well as the ACT, who obviously makes the ACTs. We have been made aware that they are looking to provide more future dates. So they're probably going to add dates to their calendar in addition to what was already available to make up for the exams that were postponed or canceled. Obviously, again, a lot of this depends on like what's going to happen to coronavirus in the next few weeks. And I can't say for certain that there's going to be opportunities, but at least that's the plan. Obviously, APs have been moved online, so there is a possibility that maybe SAT2s and SAT can move online. We don't know. I do know that ACT is exploring the option of offering fall online testing. Why is all of this important? Okay, so one big thing I want everyone to really think about throughout this presentation is that all the organizations and entities that we'll talk about, whether it's like the test prep organizations like ACTs and College Board via the SATs or individual colleges, is that at the end of the day, they are all institutions that, they're companies that make money, right? So testing optional isn't in the best interest of companies like SATs and ACTs, because that would cost them a huge financial hit if from now on all schools are going testing optional, right? So I think there are going to be, a lot of things that they can't do because of public health requirements and guidelines, but to the extent possible, I think they're going to push really hard to have in-person exams if possible. Maybe students have to be separated by 6 feet. Each desk will have to be separated by 6 feet, but I really do think that they're going to try their best to have future in-person test dates if possible, and certainly look at the opportunity of going online, because I don't think SAT and ACT are just going to take this line down and, lose a whole bunch of money because of this. So now the question is, given all this uncertainty, given all these changes that have already happened, that we know for a fact have happened, so we know for a fact, if you're looking at the data, a lot of juniors have not been able to take their exams because they were planning to until the exams got canceled. And usually because SAT2s are taken at the end of the school year, a whole lot of juniors, even though they may have gotten their SATs and ACTs out of the way, have not gotten their SAT2s out of the way. And a whole lot of juniors who maybe they do have an SAT and ACT score, they didn't get their top score yet, because we see through data that usually students get the highest score at the very end of the junior year. So what does this do, right? So how are schools going to react? A few things. Number one, a lot of schools have already come out and said that they are going to be testing optional for this particular admission cycle. So I can't speak to what's going to happen to freshmen and sophomores, but at least for this class, so everyone here is a parent of a junior, right? So at least for this class, there are a lot of colleges that have already come out and said, we are going testing optional for this cycle only. What that means when they say testing optional, now, there are varieties, but generally speaking, when they say testing optional, they mean it is no longer a requirement for us that you have ACT or SAT scores when you apply. For example, and this isn't just like random colleges here and there, I'm including like very selective colleges, right? So for example, Cornell University has come out and said that they will be testing optional this year, so this junior year, okay? They were never testing optional before. Schools that were already testing optional, like Wake Forest, will continue to be testing optional. So we are expecting there to be a much like bigger trend of colleges going testing optional. That doesn't mean every single college will go testing optional. A lot of schools have been very silent. So there are far more schools that have been silent than the schools that have come out and said. A part of it is because I think they're all waiting to see what's going to happen in the next few weeks, right? At a certain point, if every single SAT and ACT is going to get canceled all the way through the fall into winter, then yeah, we're not gonna have an option but to almost go all testing optional. But I think a lot of schools are taking a wait and see approach to see if more tests in the fall can make up for these missing tests, right? Some schools have taken a hybrid approach. So for example, MIT has said, they haven't said anything about ACT and SAT just yet, but they have said that they're going to waive SAT2 subject tests. So there are a lot of different, variations of what could take place. But there is some thought that if SAT and ACT comes back in the fall with more test dates and online testing, then probably fewer schools are going to go testing optional and still going to require testing regardless. There's even an alternative model that some colleges are considering pushing back their early decision, early action deadlines so that students can take tests in the fall so that they don't have to go testing optional, but they understand that things are a little bit delayed, so they're going to push back early decision, early action. So again, the takeaway here is that when it comes to exams and test dates, there's a very high likelihood that we're going to go testing optional for a lot of schools, which means previously somebody who didn't have test scores would be only applying to a certain set of schools. This year only, they're probably going to be eligible to apply to a lot more schools than before. At a certain point, if it's really infeasible to have tests, through the fall and winter, I think we're going to go all testing optional. But we just haven't gotten there yet, right? I can't say for certain that we're there yet, just because a lot of this will depend on the next few weeks. But I do know for certain 100% there will be more schools that are testing optional than ever before, including very selective top tier colleges. So who does this impact, right? I think with every policy change, I kind of have like two columns, the winners and the losers, right? Students who get impacted positively, students who get impacted negatively. There are a lot of students who get like neutrally impacted, but usually that's not the case, okay? So who gets impacted positively, assuming that testing optional becomes the norm for this cycle, right? Number one, if your student has a very high GPA and a lower test score. So this is what we mean when we say mismatched student. If your student has a very high GPA, but lower than their test score, corresponding test score, this individual is likely going to be positively impacted. So for example, Somebody who is, very high weighted GPA, almost at the max, 4.7, right? A corresponding ACT score would be like a 33, 34. So if your student is scoring like 27, 28, they're going to be positively impacted by this change because they will now be able to apply to other colleges that weren't open to them previously without a test score, right? So the problem is when you apply without a test score, which we'll talk a lot about for the rest of the presentation, that doesn't mean the admission cycle is exactly the same. It means that other pieces of the puzzle will have more focus now, right? Like grades, for example. But again, this is why if your student had a really high GPA and a low test score, they get positively impacted, right? Because now that tension is shifted on something that they were doing really well on. Okay, so those folks who have high GPAs, lower than matching test scores are going to be positively impacted by this change. One thing that we'll talk a little bit more about is that just because they're positively impacted doesn't necessarily mean that admissions is going to be easier for them. Okay, and I'll explain that in the next slide, but just keep that in the back of your mind for now. Who is being directly negatively impacted? Students who have lower GPAs, but would have had a higher test score had they been able to take the test. So for example, students who on mocks were getting 33, 34, they were going to take, one of the ACTs that were canceled and just haven't been able to. And in school, they haven't done as well, right? So for example, if you have a GPA 4.2 and on mocks you were scoring 33 and 34, you would have been negatively impacted because you haven't had the opportunity to show your test score that is relatively stronger compared to your GPA. That doesn't necessarily mean that you'll never get the opportunity to show it, but at least if we go off the presumption that will continue to be testing optional, those students will be negatively impacted. Okay, so now the question is, if I have scores, so if I took an ACT and SAT before they were canceled, should I submit scores? That is a really, really tricky question. If it's going to help you in the sense that if it's going to corroborate because it matches your GPA, yes, 100% you should send it, 100%. So for example, if I'm working for University of Maryland admissions and I have two candidates who's, I know people are never the exact same, but let's just pretend for all intents and purposes, these people are the exact same GPA, same SE, same extracurriculars and everything. And they both have 4.4, let's say. And one person has an ACT score, matching ACT score of 31 or 32. The other person doesn't have an ACT score. I would absolutely hedge my bet on the person who has an ACT score because that's a proven 100% certainty. The other person, I don't know. That's a question mark, right? So schools can say all they want that like, oh, we won't penalize you for not having a test score, but indirectly they will because they're going to go with certainty over uncertainty, right? So if you have a test score and it could help you, then yes, you should absolutely submit it. Usually what we mean by help is that it matches your corresponding GPA. It doesn't make you less competitive, or it outmatches you. Do even better on that test than you did on your GPA. There's going to be a lot of gray area. There's going to be a lot of like right on the edge, this score is in line with what the college is expecting. Should we send it or should we not? Or it's almost matching my GPA. There's going to be a lot of case by case basis, which, obviously talk to us before you make a decision. But in general, if the score is going to help you, absolutely send it. If the score doesn't help you, if it's mismatched with your GPA, don't send it because you're better off not having a score than having a certain score that they know for certainty isn't what they're looking for. The next question is, the other common question regarding test scores is, assuming tests become available for, taking, right? So in the fall, we do have more exams. Should you take a future exam? Because right now, assuming that colleges go testing optional, you have the perfect excuse for not having exam score, right? So is it even worth your time to take it? Again, I think it really depends on individual situation. If you're looking for a test score that's going to match your GPA and help and corroborate your narrative based on your mock scores, then yeah, you should take it. Because again, colleges are going to prioritize and want certainty over uncertainty, right? But if you know that test scores have been the struggle for you and you haven't been able to match it with your GPA, then perhaps think about not taking it. So what do I mean? So for example, if you have like a 4.5 weighted GPA, the corresponding ACT is usually a 32. If you're scoring at like a mid-20s right now, I would seriously consider not taking it, not prepping it, because I think there's so much more things that you need to do that's on your plate. And if we're that far off, maybe you can get there, maybe you can't. And at that point, we're not focusing on what we should be focusing on. So the last two questions are underlined. I can't make a blanket policy for anyone because it depends on the individual student situation and their profile and their test scores. So if you have any individual questions, don't ask today, just, send me a message privately because I don't want to talk about personal, decisions on today's webinar. Now, so the second thing I want to talk about is grades and grades, which is the other part of the academic profile that we talk about when it comes to grades and test scores. Grades are a hot mess right now. As I'm sure a lot of people who are in the Montgomery County public school system knows, there's just a lot of confusion and uncertainty. I think private schools as a whole have been doing a better job of explaining what's going to happen, and their individual policies vary. But since most of the people on today's call are MCPS students, I do want to talk about how grades as a whole are being evaluated, and then also how grades will be evaluated in a college admission sense. So MCPS has come out and said that all fourth quarter grades, so public schools in Montgomery County, all fourth quarter grades are going to be pass-fail only. This is very, very common among all public schools in the country now, so it's not just MCPS. What they haven't clarified is, what does that mean for the final second semester grades? And I have no idea because I personally, I don't think MCPS even knows right now, which is why they haven't clarified, and I just don't have any historical data to look at when it comes to MCPS policies. But a part of me thinks that's going to be super difficult to give a grade for the second semester when one quarter is pass-fail. I don't know how they could do it equitably, right? So my best guess is that they're either going to give out pass-fails for the semester for everyone, or maybe in the off chance allow students to have their second quarter grade be their final quarter. We don't know. But the good and bad thing, the good thing is that this policy is affecting all MCPS kids. So your student isn't going to be the one who's like the only one being impacted. But it does kind of shift the priorities a little bit. Again, there are winners and losers, right? The winners would be, if you were doing like not so great third quarter, right? And you were getting like lower the grades than you normally would, or you've been really stretched thin because your courses in junior year have been too difficult in terms of like time, workload or whatever, then you benefit because in all likelihood, pass-fail is going to be the option, right? I think students who are getting straight A's in third quarter, who are doing really well, who are on track to get, a huge improvement, a huge boost in their GPA, they kind of lose out. I think the students who lose out the most are those who didn't do so well freshman and sophomore year, who really needed this year to pull up their GPA. Unfortunately, this is a huge loss, especially if they were on track to get a really high GPA, which is why I think one thing that parents can do on this call is that if you feel like your students are being negatively impacted, please get in contact with MCPS. At least ask them to make grades an option, right? So that it's really unfair for the kids who worked really hard in junior year to increase their GPA all of a sudden not having this option, because it could make a pretty big difference. But the other big thing is, I think this is going to make even a bigger difference because during this admission cycle, we're expecting colleges to view grades with much more scrutiny and rigor than before. If test scores are out the window, then the only academic profile I have are your grades. So it's really important that students whose GPA weren't that strong have the opportunity to increase their GPA. So a few things that we want to be just aware of generally. Make sure that senior year classes, this was always the case, but even more so now, make sure your senior year classes are really rigorous, right? So whatever classes that you sign up for senior year, you may want to revisit them again and think about how rigorous they are, just because again, if I don't have test scores to look at, your transcript is the only thing I have to look at when it comes to your academic profile. So I really need seniors, senior year classes to be really rigorous. Number two, because test scores, again, are not going to be looked at for a lot of schools, we're expecting a higher weighted GPA in terms of average or median accepted for particular schools. So what do I mean by this? For the top tier schools, we're talking about like the Ivies, right? Or schools like the Ivies, like Stanford, MIT. There's really not that much more they can increase. Like the average GPA is already north of 4.7. Like there's literally mathematically very little you can do to increase. So I think that's gonna stay largely the same, right? But I think for schools like University of Maryland, right, whose average is about 4.2, 4.3, depending on which MCPS school you go to, I would predict, I would assume that there's going to be an increase to that. I don't think it's going to go crazy. I don't think it's going to go from 4.3 to 4.7 all of a sudden. But I do think it's going to go from 4.3 to perhaps 4.4 or even 4.5 just for this year. Not for like an average for all the years, but just the junior class. Why? Again, because if I don't have test scores and I'm only relying on my GPA, I'm going to look for higher GPAs. I'm going to look for things that make up the uncertainty with the test score disappearing. So I can't emphasize this enough. It is super important for our students to do well, and for parents, if this impacts their student, which I think for most people on the call it does, to ask MCPS to clarify their policy and hopefully give students the option of having grades in addition to pass fail, so that the juniors who are doing well won't get penalized by not having a GPA, right? Like, I know they're not being directly penalized, but indirectly they are, because colleges are going to be looking at grades and grades more so now that test scores are gone. Okay, that was a lot. This is like the biggest aspect in terms of like academic profiles. So if anyone has any questions about grades and test scores in particular, please put on the chat. We have a lot more to cover. So if you have other questions, don't ask them now, just because I'll probably be answering them in the next few slides. But if you have any questions about what I just went over regarding test scores and grades, please put that in the chat. Okay. So I don't see any questions, so I'll move on. But if more questions come up, feel free to put it in the chat. Okay, so in terms of extracurricular, so again, I think the takeaway here is that regardless of what happens with grades, right, we know for a fact that more colleges are going to be testing optional. Okay, so that means even if ACT and SAT are going to be more available in the fall, there's still going to be colleges like Cornell that have already come out and said we're going testing optional. So I think other things are going to be looked upon more. And again, it's just not just my word, right? Like, if people have been reading my emails, you guys would have seen the copy and paste I did from Cornell admission officers, who talked about how this isn't really a win-win for people, because a lot of people previously said, well, test scores are not fair, right? But no evaluation is going to be truly fair. When test scores go away, other more subjective factors are going to come in more into play. And that could be a good or bad thing depending on how students react. So extracurriculars, especially for the top tier colleges, have always been a difference maker, way more so than grades, because the top tier candidates all have very high similar grades. So extracurriculars are going to be even more important now than before. So one few things is like, one, don't, try to, I know like students are very stressed out right now. So obviously I'm not saying they're staying at home and doing nothing, but try to avoid the whole, well, I don't have anything to do, so I'm just not gonna do anything, right? So there are always things that you can do, but even from the comforts of your own home, even from like not being able to do things in person, just online, get creative and do projects. We have a lot of students right now who are working on their own projects online or remotely, and it's really great. So just really try to make sure that you continue with your extracurriculars as to the extent possible, and even think about new ways in which that you could connect with people and have an impact. But the biggest thing is prioritize quality, right? Don't be like, oh, I'm going to start 20 different online activities, right? Like, just like you would for any admission cycle, quality is super important. And be aware that there is going to be a saturation of certain activities. So again, just like any other time, you really want to make sure that your extracurriculars make sense to you, right? Does it make sense to your profile based on your major and the strategies that we've talked about, right? Obviously right now, a lot of people are doing Corona related activities, right? Helping out the community, which is something people should be doing anyways, right? Like regardless of college admissions, but really think about if what you're doing makes sense to your admissions profile. Okay, I know I'm kind of being a little bit vague right now, but that's partially because I don't want to get into individual situations, because I don't want to speak about individual situations on the whole platform. Okay, so what are some of the other impacts? Overall, just as like, a general trend, I do think for this year's juniors, it's going to be much more difficult in terms of admissions. And I'll say that again. I do think for this year junior class, it is going to be much more difficult, and I'll explain why. Number one, I don't think Naviance is going to be as reliable as it previously was, right? Like, for the reasons we explained, we expect GPAs to go up. We expect test scores to be a non-factor for a lot of schools. Number two, this is the biggest thing, pulling all the things that we just talked about together. I think colleges are going to get a bigger pool of applicants. Here's what I mean by a bigger pool of applicants. Previously, we've had a lot of students, for example, who had a qualifying GPA, like their GPA matches the averages that the college is looking for, but they couldn't get their test scores up there, right? So if you have like a 4.7 and a 28, you're going to be mismatching a lot of colleges because your GPA and your test score mismatch. So in those instances, students may be like, well, it's just not worth it for me to apply to a school that I think is unrealistic, right? Because I don't have the test score that they're looking for. Okay. Well, the problem is if test scores are now optional, if schools are now testing optional, that pool of people who were previously eliminated and deterred from applying now are eligible, right? Like they look very competitive, right? So now that pool of students who think that like, hey, I have a good chance, just as a good chance as anyone else, that pool is getting bigger, right? The other way to think about it is if you think about test scores previously as something that weeded students out, right? I mean, the first thing a lot of admissions people don't do before they even read essays or anything, they look at GPA and test score. And if you're not close to what they're looking for, they're not looking at you anymore, right? Because why should I spend the next few hours looking at essays when I know the answer is no? Doesn't make sense, right? The problem is that huge component, the test score, is now not a factor anymore. So more people are going to be applying knowing that they're not going to be weeded out immediately. So the pool of people who are applying it's going to be bigger, right? And I also think that generally speaking, when you look at previous cycles, like what happens when there's uncertainty, right? We usually see an increase of people applying. So while we know that, like, for example, some students may not be applying because their financial circumstances may have changed, I don't think that's going to be really pertinent to our area. Like, I don't think we're going to see a huge decrease of seniors from Montgomery County not applying because of financial reasons, generally speaking, because that probably isn't going to impact the MCPS families as much as other people in the country. So I think for MCPS students in particular, it's going to be harder because the average student is going to be applying to more colleges so that they know they're being safe given the uncertainty, and that because they're not being weeded out, the pools are going to be bigger as a whole, which means that more people are applying, right? And Naviance is unreliable. These are all things that make things harder, okay? The other thing that makes this cycle really weird and a lot harder is what's happening with this year's seniors. Now, usually the senior class decisions don't affect the junior class, right? Like usually whether or not your friend decides to take a gap year or do something weird or get off a weight, like it probably isn't going to affect you. The problem is this year already we're seeing wild yields, like crazy yields, right? If you talk to any of your seniors, you'll know that we're seeing more waitlist offers than ever before and earlier before. Usually on any given year around this time, it's really early for students to hear from waitlist schools. This year, like all bets are off. We're getting crazy offers left and right, way more frequent than usual, way earlier than usual. What does that mean? Why is this happening? A lot of it is because a lot of students are deferring their college acceptances. So because they don't know what's going to happen in the fall, we have a lot of students who are like, well, you know, I don't really want to do an online school in the fall. That's horrible. Or like, I don't really want to travel to New York City in the fall because, you know, coronavirus. Or international students who like physically can't travel. Like they physically cannot come to the United States because they can't get their visas and all this travel is uncertain. So we're seeing way more than average number of students who are deferring their admissions, okay? When you defer your admissions, so let's say I'm a senior who's been accepted to Cornell, right? I'm accepted. They're not going to take that away without reason, unless like I did something horrible. They're not going to reset my application. I've been accepted, right? So I usually have the option to also defer my enrollment, saying like if I want to take a gap year or take a year off for whatever reason, and to say that I'm going to start not this fall when I'm supposed to start as a senior, but next fall, okay? So usually these micro decisions that are made at the individual level doesn't really impact admissions because they're just few here and there, and we're expecting that. But if we have a lot of people who are deferring enrollment because of coronavirus, right, that is going to impact admissions for your cycle, right? Because you can't have a bunch of people deferring and taking spots for the next year's class and the next year's class being the same as normal, right? So that's yet another reason why we think that's going to be slightly harder if people are taking spots from the next year's class because they're deferring enrollment, okay? So this is why we think that, you know, all things being equal, students should really make sure that their safety is truly a safety, even accounting for slightly increased GPA than what exists on Naviance, even accounting for the fact that they may not have test scores, right? And that on average, every student should really be applying to a healthy number of schools just because things are very uncertain. Okay, I do see I'm getting a few questions on the chat. I'm going to be answering, there's two questions in particular that one I've already answered and two that I'm going to get to really soon. So now, some folks have asked me like, well, do you think, like, we know the reason why things might be a little bit more difficult now because of what you said, but do you think this will be made up by the fact that fewer international students are going to be applying given coronavirus and therefore make things easier? Yes and no. So as a whole, most colleges accept way more domestic students than international students, right? So it's not like there's going to be all these spots left over, like half of enrollment left over for filling, right? So I don't think it's going to make things a lot easier because there are a lot of international students who are already in the United States. Like they're classified as international, but they go to a school in the United States. So a whole bunch of international students are still going to be able to apply, right? It's not like all of a sudden all the international students disappear, right? And usually admission offices treat international students and domestic students in two separate pools. So if anything, I do think that this year may make, this year being junior year, it may be easier for international students to apply and get into college because their international peers are not as plentiful as before, but they have their own uncertainty that we'll talk about in a second. But that's their ease of admission chances is still pretty difficult compared to domestic students. And the fact that their admission cycle is getting easier compared to any other year doesn't make your admission cycle easier because they recruit from two different pools, right? Like the spots that I have reserved for international students aren't going to go to domestic students unless I truly run out of international students. I don't think that's going to be the case just because there are enough international students who can travel who are already in the United States for that to be a difference maker. Having said that, though, I think the difference could be not for admissions, but from a financial standpoint. So if international students really, like there's really a lack of international students applying, there's just not enough international students who can travel, who are stateside, who can extend their visa, and so on and so forth. International students, usually when they go to college, they pay full tuition. So they're, for lack of a better word, they make a lot of money for colleges, right? So in the event that they're expecting a lower enrollment in international students, especially because right now, 1/3, which is insane, but 1/3 of all international students who apply to US colleges for undergrad are from China, right? So that's a lot of students. And if coronavirus really gets worse in the fall, then maybe we are in a territory where international enrollment actually impacts domestic enrollment. I don't think we're there yet. But in the event that we are, this is probably going to make financial aid a little bit more difficult, which we'll talk about in the bottom of the slide. But I'm only pointing this out by saying that I don't think the impact from international students is going to be large enough to overcome the fact of all the other things that we talked about that will make this admission cycle more difficult. Okay. If we're presuming that admission cycle is going to be different and more difficult, we can't look at test scores. We're going to see higher weighted GPAs, and then we're going to see a huge increase on the subjective factors. These are things that I think everyone should really pay attention to. I think these are things that there's going to be a lot of things I think parents can do to help us help your students. So what do I mean? I think there's going to be definitely, not just this year, but for years to come, I think there's going to be a saturation of certain majors, like public health, right? Like this is good and bad. So for a lot of students who never thought about public health before, who never thought about STEM careers or health careers, all of a sudden they're living it. They're like living a pandemic and realizing the importance of this, and maybe they're inspired and they want to learn more about this and actually go into the medical field. That's great. I am definitely not telling people not to major in those things, but people should be aware that's probably going to be sometimes more, sometimes less competitive. What do I mean by this? I think the juniors this year, we're expecting a lot of people applying to public health kind of last minute. Like they kind of just realized they're really interested in this because of everything that's happening. In some ways, if you've had a public health or health related narrative this whole time, we've been working on this whole time, you're going to be much better off. Because even though more people are going to be applying, it's quality, not quantity, right? Like, yeah, the more people that apply, the better, because a lot of those people aren't going to be super prepared. They haven't been preparing for this public health narrative their entire high school career. You have. You will win out, right? I think students who are now just realizing like, oh, maybe I should do public health, this is really interesting. I probably would not make that decision like last minute, just because there's going to be tons of people doing that, and it's going to be harder for you if you don't have that public health narrative. If you're a parent of a younger student, we're not going to talk about too much of that right now, but just know that if your student is making that shift, they should really be making sure that their narrative fits that shift. Also, regardless of whether or not your student is interested in public health major or any kind of health STEM major, we're going to see, I'm predicting a huge wave of corona-related essays, like essays about its impact, essays about what they've done, so on and so forth. And I'm not saying that nobody should be writing essays on coronavirus. I'm saying that just like any other cliche topic, if you write about it, and you know that you're writing about something that's going to be overwritten, you better make sure your essay really stands out. You better make sure your angle is so different from all the other kids, right? So for example, every season we tell students like sports essays are really overdone. That doesn't mean a sports essay can't ever stand out. That just means that if you are doing a sports essay, you need to really make sure that your story is super different from everyone else who could tell a similar sports story, right? I think this is where parents can help us the most, okay? I think for most students, writing the actual essay isn't the difficult part, right? Because they lived it, they breathed it, they know how they feel, they're really passionate about their own life, right? I think the most difficult part for most students is just getting the right idea. Like, I can't tell you how many phone calls I've been on where people are like, nothing interesting has ever happened to me. I don't know what to write about. I mean, that's where I kind of get stuck, right? Like, I don't know what happened to you when you were in 5th grade. I don't know what happened to you when you were, 16 years old. So if you don't tell me, I will never know. And sometimes I think parents are even more helpful than a student in this situation when they're like, oh, well, I remember the time when this happened, right? Like, I mean, we always welcome parents to help us with brainstorming. I think that's one thing that, like, you all know your students way more than we know your students. So we could really help out to make sure that their essay topics are really personal and dear to them, and that they're really writing out on something that makes them different. Like, you know what makes your kid unique. You know what their strengths are. You know how they stand out from the crowd. That's what we want to focus on. And sometimes students may need a little bit more pushing or reminding in terms of like finding out what their true story is. I think one thing a lot of students should be really careful about, on this chat, for example, I think a lot of students are of the Asian American descent. Essays are really, really important, especially for Asian American students, because there are a lot of stereotypes that exist within the admissions cycle when it comes to Asian American students. Again, I obviously don't believe in these stereotypes, but they exist. So for example, a lot of admission officers think that Asian American students are too overly academic, that they don't show enough leadership, that they're not engaged in their community as much. So these are all things that these subjective factors, essays included, should remedy. Right? So really try to stand out with your essay and be as personal, to really try to put your personality on paper. Okay, so other ways in which you can show your interest to school and your personality, although the subjective factors beyond essays, which is a huge portion, are letters of recommendation. I know this has been another point of concern for a lot of parents and students. A lot of students were hoping to ask their second semester teachers because they didn't feel that connected with their first semester teacher. And a lot of people are like, well, now I don't really feel connected to my second semester teacher either because I've only seen them for a few weeks and then I've never seen them again, right? I would say for the most part, it's probably not the best idea to ask your second semester teacher given how things have played out. I'm all for Zoom online sessions, but I think, an in-person relationship probably is better off than whatever you've been able to cultivate through Zoom. So unless your experience has been different, my suggestion is we still probably go with the first semester teachers. You had the best practices from us. We've given that manual out to everyone, but I'll repeat it again. In general, you want junior year teachers on core courses. In general, regardless of major, you want one STEM, one humanities. And then if you have the opportunity to double up, you should double up based on your major and your narrative. And then there's also other people who can write for you beyond teachers, like your counselor, like internship mentors, like volunteer coordinators, and so forth, what we call other writers, right? So these writers are going to be even more important than before, right? So really make sure you select your writers carefully and that they're really willing to advocate and go to bat for you. The next thing, I think this next thing gets so underutilized. Like I cannot stress this enough. I think the next part gets so underestimated and underutilized. Now I understand, like, for most 17, 18-year-olds, like their preference isn't like, oh, let me just go randomly network with somebody I've never met. Like, it's not comfortable for them. So that's why they don't do it, right? It's because they don't enjoy it. But it can make a huge difference. So when I say networking, I mean connecting with admission officers. I mean connecting with your interviewers, whether it's a student from that college or alum of that college, or connecting with alums that you know, not even through interviews, just, in the community. Like, let's say you're club sponsors and alum of the school, right? What I mean by connecting is like really making sure that like you go to them, you have conversations with them, and you're not just like pestering them with emails just to email them, right? So for example, we've had students write, thank you emails about, after their interviews, right? A thank you email, for example, that just like is one sentence long, like, thank you for emailing me. I mean, that's nice, that's better than nothing, but we're really looking for quality engagement. So if, you don't know what that means, let me know and I could give you some samples. But, you know, really go into deep thought and think about how you approach these people in these conversations and really try to make sure that you are being genuine in those connections. For example, I had a student last year who wrote a thank you letter to their Penn interviewer. And it was a very thoughtful letter, very long. And the interviewer was so impressed, she actually called the student back to say thank you over the phone. And she told him point blank that he was going to be ranked the first one, like for Penn admissions, and as an alumni, I've done the same thing. For Penn admissions, we have to rank the students. She flat out told him, you're going to be ranked the #1 out of all my interviewers, right? So that student ended up getting into Penn. I think those things can make a bigger difference, even more so than before, given the weird cycle that we're in. Okay. Now, a few students have asked me, like, you know, how will this impact things like xenophobic concerns, especially with Asian American students, especially with Chinese American students? As a whole, now, obviously, there's going to be bad apples in every single group, right? Like, I'm sure there's going to be some admission officer out there who's just explicitly racist, right? That's not something that I can change, unfortunately. But generally speaking, colleges tend to be way more, I would say, like liberal, progressive than the general population. So I don't think xenophobia is going to be that big of a concern. I think, if anything, the bigger concern is what they're going to do with, you know, stereotypes running Asian American students, right? Because that's more implicit and built in, and that's something that I think colleges are cognizant of trying to work around, but still kind of embedded in people's culture and minds. But I don't think colleges are going to be like, you know, xenophobic explicitly towards students. I do think the bigger trend when it comes to international students is that a lot of colleges are realizing now that they've been over-relying on China for the pipeline of international students. So I wouldn't be surprised if years down the line, as we're coming out of this coronavirus weird kind of mission cycle, that they start recruiting more heavily around the world in other countries and not just exclusively in China. Because again, like the data is kind of mind-blowing that 1/3 of international students are all applying from China alone. Okay. So speaking with international students, I said I was going to come back to this at the very end. We do think that there's going to be a decline in institutional wealth throughout colleges. I think for the most part, like the top tier colleges that have like insane amount of endowment, they're going to be fine. Like the Ivies are going to be completely fine. But I mean, even they're impacted, I think their long-term goal planning is going to be completely fine. But generally speaking, like state schools, like University of Maryland or other similar public institutions, they're going to take a big hit, especially because states themselves are taking a big hit, taxpayers, everyone's taking a big hit. So institutional wealth as a whole is definitely going to be declining. International students may decline. They are the ones who usually pay full tuition, so that's going to make things possibly even worse, right? So how is it going to impact admissions? We don't deal a lot with financial aid when we're working with students, but I do know that a few students, you know, are really looking for scholarships when they're applying. So just keep that in mind, that in all likelihood, especially from your public institutions, they may be like less scholarship opportunities. And think about how that could impact your college list. Again, I'm going to avoid like personal recommendations for, you know, when we talk amongst ourselves, but just think about like, you know, how does this change your college list? You want to apply to more safety schools, increase your chance of getting scholarships, knowing that scholarships are going to be important to you and so forth. For other students, pretty much everyone, right, regardless of your situation, this is probably going to increase the attractiveness of ED from a college perspective, because colleges know that when you're applying to ED, usually it means that you're committed to the school and you're more likely to attend because financially you're more likely able to, you know, attend, right? So I do think that ED in the times of like weird yields, uncertainty, is going to be a even more attractive option to colleges. So, you know, if there's ever a year where, I mean, you should always be leveraging early decision options, but if there's ever a year to really leverage it, it would be this year. But again, we talked about how like whatever missing international students, you know, go missing in this cycle, it's not going to make up for the other difficulties, because really admission cycles, if there's missing international students, they're going to try to replace it with international students. And I think there's enough international students who can travel, who are already in America, for that to still go around. I think it's going to have a huge impact for other schools, right? Like lower tier schools, but not for the top tier schools. Okay. Before I talk about the next part, which is super important, I'm going to check the chat because I am getting a few messages. So I'm being told that MCPS just sent an email about fourth quarter grading, and that final GPA will come out on May 12th. I have not seen this email. But after, I'm just trying to see if I can see it right now. Let me see. I want to see if I can see that right now, just so that we could talk about, okay. So it's going to be a bit longer than what I can read over in 5 minutes, but I'll definitely take a look at this and update everybody on this workshop about how this could change things. Let me look at a few other comments here. Do you think state schools will take less in-state students? It really depends on the state structure. The big thing about out-of-state students is that they pay higher tuition than in-state residents, right? Usually they still take way more in-state residents because you don't want to make your taxpayers all upset, right? Like that's why you give a preference to in-state students over out-of-state students. So usually you'll see that out-of-state students pay more because they pay out-of-state tuition, but then you also see that usually on average they have higher GPA than test scores because it's usually easier since schools show preference for in-state students. Do I think more schools now, public schools, will take out-of-state students? I think it depends on their state budget. I think it depends on how much coronavirus is going to mess up with their state budget. If it's, if you're living in a state that's been really drastically a lot of states have been impacted by coronavirus and your state budget, it's not just about how much you've been impacted, but how bad your budget deficit is. Yeah, I think if this year, more than any other year, it's more likely that they're going to look for out-of-state residents because those people pay a higher tuition and therefore can fund their state budget more so than other schools. I have no idea which schools those are going to be because I have no idea what the state budget situation is going to be like. But yes, I would say that more so than any other previous years, state schools are probably going to take more out-of-state students because of budgetary concerns. Let's see. Someone else says, are AP scores optional along with SAT and ACT? AP scores have always been optional. AP scores are not admission tests. SAT and ACT tests are admission tests. APs are not. If you have high AP scores, so 4s or 5s, you should send them. Typically 3 is the gray area and we have to analyze your individual situations, but we usually don't send 1 or 2s. Let's see. Somebody said, since private schools are continuing on this semester through this outbreak while MCPS isn't, will this negatively impact me since my grades have been better during the shutdown while NCPS isn't counting them? No, it's going to be positively impacting you because your high grades are being counted, whereas somebody who's the equivalent of you at MCPS, their grades may not be counted. So they're going to be at a deficit because if you're trying to increase your GPA, you've been given the opportunity to do so, whereas someone in MCPS haven't had the opportunity to do so if MCPS is just going to give out blanket pass fails to everyone. How much do AP scores for this year matter? That's a really great question. So AP scores this year is going to be kind of crazy, right? Because it's definitely seen as less valid given that it's online. We're expecting there to be a lot of cheating if we're being realistic, right? It's also a shorter content, so less content anyways. But here's the thing, I think they still matter, especially because if schools are really gonna go testing optional, then they're left with nothing else besides AP scores to look at if you send it to them. And especially because I do think there's going to be more cheating, I think even though the tests themselves will be easier, I think the curve will be harder. So don't underestimate APs. Obviously, if I look at other AP scores from freshman and sophomore year, those are going to be seen as more valid, but I wouldn't discount this year. Like I wouldn't be like, oh, okay, now I could just fail all my APs and it won't matter. I just won't send them. I don't think that's going to help you. I much rather that you send a bunch of APs that even their validity as a whole may be questionable. Having 4s and 5s are definitely better than nothing, right? Like always think about how certainty is better than uncertainty from the college's perspective because they're taking less of a gamble on you. But yeah, generally speaking, AP scores matter less than ACT and SATs. Okay. Any other questions about anything that we covered so far? So like, test scores, GPA, extracurriculars, networking, subjective factors, how this admissions will be harder, impact on international students, anything that we haven't covered yet? Because now we're going to talk about something else that's like super, 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 super important. Okay, I don't see any questions. So, because of all of this, right, because there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, because colleges know that their pools are going to be bigger, that on average, more kids are probably going to be applying to college, or not more kids, the average person's going to be, so not only were more kids going to be applying to college, okay, let me back up, I'm confusing everybody. So a few things. I think there are going to be people who are not going to be applying to college at all anymore because their financial situations isn't going to be, feasible for them to do so, right? But I don't think that's going to be really impacting Montgomery County residents. I also think historically, if you look at the data, the competing side of that data is that usually in times of recession, more people go back to college or more people apply to college because they want to ride out the job market. So I still think more people are going to be applying to college. I don't know if it's going to be a big difference because again, I don't know how coronavirus is going to go into the fall and winter. But for all intents and purposes, I don't think the number of people applying to college from Montgomery County is going to change because I don't think financial situation is going to change students' decision making all that much in this county. I do think the average person, because of everything that we talked about before, because of and mainly because test scores are gone now, I think the average student is going to be applying to more college. Okay, so let me clarify that again. I'm not sure whether or not more people are going to be applying to college. I think there's an argument to be made on both sides. But I am sure that other kids who are applying to college, they will be applying to more colleges per kid because that weed out factor is not going to be as present, okay? And because people are looking for safer options, more financially flexible options. So with the average kid applying to more colleges, and colleges know this, with yield being crazy, like this year's yield is literally insane. It's just, you can't even compare to any other yield. We're seeing insane amount of yields. I think more than ever, and with campus tours being canceled, right? And a lot of engagement, in-person fairs being canceled. More than ever, I think colleges are going to be looking really closely at demonstrated interest. It just that they're going to be defining demonstrated interest a little bit differently, right? Like no one's going to expect you to visit a college campus in the middle of a pandemic, right? And I would advise against that. They're closed anyways, right? But they're going to look at other factors to see whether or not someone is genuinely interested in their school, or they're just one of those kids who are applying to more schools because everyone's applying to more schools. That's going to be a huge problem for colleges, okay? This, like, if we go back to what we said earlier about colleges being companies, right? At the very end of the day, they care about their endowment, their bottom line, their ranking. Yield is super important to colleges, especially if they want to make up for this weird, crazy yield year, right? So for the reasons above that we talked about, showing genuine interest in the school that you're going to, I mean, you should be doing this anyways for any cycle, but even more so for this cycle as we're predicting like really weird things happening, it's going to be super important, as especially because the colleges are very concerned about this. So how do you show interest? It's so important that I devoted a single slide just to this, okay? A single slide just to showing interest to colleges in the year of coronavirus. One quick thing, somebody said, what do you mean by yield? So yield measures the number of students who accept you back. So for example, if I accept 10 students and nobody comes to my school, that's really bad. That makes my ranking go down. If I accept 10 students and all of them come to my school, now no college is hitting 100%. Harvard has like the highest yield, like hovering around 90. But if all 10 kids come to my school, my yield looks really good. So the problem is if the average kid is applying to more colleges and that weed out factor isn't there, I mean, then that means everyone can only go to one college anyways, right? Like you could only go to one college. So if you're applying to more colleges, despite the fact that you only go to one college, we're expecting more uncertainty when it comes to yield, right? So that means that colleges are going to be paying really close attention to demonstrated interest, because it's super important for me to figure out who's applying, who's actually interested in my school versus who's applying, I'm just another school, another number, especially if college campuses are closed for visitation. So how do you show interest in the era of coronavirus? Before I get to that, one quick question that's super important. Someone's asking, how do colleges know when someone opens an email? I know when people open my emails, not just because they don't respond to me, but also because we can track your data, right? So colleges use this. Like they spend so much money, like an insane amount of money working with big tech companies on big data. It is like, it's a well-known secret that they spend like a huge chunk of their money trying to figure out who's actually interested and who's not really interested. So this is all information that they can track. When they send it to your email addresses, they get feedback on which people have actually opened their email and who haven't, right? I think most public schools probably aren't going to be tracking it as carefully, but I could tell you private schools already do this. I think they're going to be even more focused on it this year than ever before. I mean, we could do it, like we don't do it for every email, but when we sent mass emails, we could tell who opens our emails and who don't. Colleges have way more sophisticated tools than we do that they spend like thousands and thousands of dollars on. So how do you show interest in this coronavirus year where a lot of things have shifted to remote demonstrated interest? please attend a virtual tour, info session, webinars, right? Like just like you would in person. This is going to be the replacement for now until things get better. Please complete online information request forms on college websites. Like humor me. Even if you're like, I'm just going to delete this, fine, fill it out anyways, right? Same thing with their college newsletter. Fine, delete it after they send it to you, but sign up for it anyways. Please open their emails. You could just open it and not read it. I don't care, but just at least open it, right? Obviously, also open my emails. Some people, I'm not gonna name names, some people, it takes them like an average of like 2, 3, 4 emails for me to, finally get a hold of them, usually after I CC their parents. Some people have been really good with emails. So I like to bother your parents as little as possible, but when people don't respond to me, it's a problem. The problem with college is that if you don't respond to them, they're not just gonna keep emailing you. They might, but you're just giving them more and more bad data that like, for all the numbers of times they emailed you, you never emailed them back, or you never responded, you never opened. That's not good. Connect on social media. It's kind of silly, but believe it or not, they do track big data. And I think that this is more likely than ever for this particular admission cycle. You could comment on their social media as well. Obviously, make sure your comments are appropriate, right? Like don't do silly, dumb things, even if you think they're not going to see it because it's anonymous online. Nothing's truly anonymous. Meet with admission officers if they end up coming to your high school. I think it depends on whether or not, coronavirus gets worse or better. If they come to a regional fair in person, obviously go to those. Visit the campus in the future if it's possible. I can't, promise you that will be possible, but maybe in the fall things will get better. If you're offered an interview, obviously please take the interview, because when you decline, that looks really bad. That looks like you're not interested. Reach out to admission officers or your interviewees or anyone connected to school with genuine questions and genuine feedback. So please do not email them just to email them. You're going to be known as somebody who pestered them. That is not a good reason to be known for. And make sure that you send, email to people who you come across. Thank you emails to those people. Those notes are kept on file. But again, make sure it's a genuine note. Like if you're just gonna be like, thank you, bye, that's probably not worth it. And really invest your time in writing the why essays. That essay is already super important in any admission cycle, but even more so for this admission cycle. That's going to be a super, super important essay. It really shows that like you care about the school, that you've done the homework, that you're more likely to attend because you know what you're talking about and you know that the school is a good fit for you. And of course, if you can, if you're in the financial position to do so, leverage your early decision choice wisely, right? One quick note, like we talked about earlier, there is a possibility that early decision deadlines may be pushed back. We just won't know for sure. Okay, on the last slide, I've included a few resources. I'll send this slide to everyone so that you don't have to like write down the hyperlinks, but just a few things. We are keeping a close eye on all the colleges. We'll be updating everyone at the end of summer. Right now, we're just kind of taking stock and collecting all the information. And when we more or less have a complete list of all colleges and their policies, we'll make that available to all of our students. But if you want to keep an eye on it, you can as well. Just a list of colleges that have gone, testing optional, whether it's for SAT or ACT or SAT2s or whatever weird hybrid policies they may have. There are a lot of virtual college events. The first link are official events being like events that the colleges themselves are putting up. There are also official fairs, like fairs that the colleges, recognize and they're putting together. And then there's unofficial resources, like UVisit. It's not done by it's not organized by the colleges, but they're still really good resources, and they could be resources that you use to help you write your why essays. There is a list of traditional in-person events that are still available right now. Obviously, I can't promise that they'll always be available. They may be canceled. A lot of events have been canceled, but that could be a list that you just want to keep an eye on, right? And of course, if in-person visits do become feasible again, make sure that you go, like we say this to students all the time, it's not just this cycle, but every cycle, make sure that you go in with an agenda. Like don't just do the tour and leave, right? Like really make sure that you engage. So for example, you could speak with admissions, you could speak with a student, you could visit a class, you could talk to a professor, you could sleep over. There's so many things you could be doing. That's just an example of a check sheet. I actually don't think that check sheet is as comprehensive as it should be, but at least like it's just an idea for people to think about when they're visiting if campuses become open again. Next two resources you'll see are the official announcement page of ACT and SAT or College Board for when future dates or online, online exams become the norm, and Montgomery County Public School updates. Okay, let me see. I have a question from a student who says, what are the importance of summer programs? Okay, so the second question, I'm not going to reveal the identifying information. The person said, I got into X and YZ program, but chose not to go because they both are online. Will that put me at a large disadvantage in terms of demonstrated interest? So summer programs are still going to be important because, which is as a whole, you should be doing something this summer to be productive, like not just nothing, right? But like summer programs, usually, especially used with ED, can really increase one's chances. These summer programs, these programs that this student is talking about, the pre-college programs, are really rigorous. They require like an application process, so it's not like, it's almost like a mini college application process. So it's not something that like everybody can get into. If you got into one of those programs, I was still, you know, if you can go, I would still go. Obviously, it's not going to be the exact same as the in-person one. It's good, things are going to be logistically difficult. Like you're not going to be able to connect with the professors like you normally would. But I would still recommend going because it does show the school like heightened interest in its mission cycle, where demonstrated interest is going to be really, really big. If you already chosen not to go, or you know for a fact that you can't go, I don't think that's going to be putting you at like, you're not going to be penalized. I want to phrase this properly. It's going to put you at a disadvantage in the sense that you'll be disadvantaged compared to people who did go, but you're not going to be penalized. You're not going to be like, you know, looking at who did go or who didn't go, who got in, and then penalizing you. Because I think in the era of coronavirus, there's a legitimate concern of why people aren't going. Like people just don't feel like the online, you know, the online platform is the same thing as an in-person platform. Okay, so that is the end of our presentation. I'm sure a lot of people may still have, you know, individual questions. If you have individual personal questions relating to your student and their particular profile or situation, please don't ask right now. Just, you know, reach out to me personally so we could talk about it. But if you have general questions regarding just, you know, anything that we covered, or maybe things that we didn't get a chance to cover, please feel free to put it in the chat and I'll definitely go over them. Someone's asking, is early action more important this cycle? I don't think it's going to be more important this cycle. Here's why. So early decision is a little bit different. Early decision is going to be more important because that's a binding decision, right? And where schools are working with weirder yields and less institutional wealth, early decision is really, really, really attractive, even more attractive than before, right? The more uncertainty there is, I mean, not even just colleges, it's just people, right? Like the more uncertainty there is, the more we look for certainty, right? So that's why I think early decision is going to be like a huge strategy for this cycle, even more so than, you know, it already is. Early action, unfortunately, no, because there's not a binding agreement to early action. You don't have to go to the school. I think it's interesting because I think on the one hand, people may be more inclined to apply to early action just because they want to know earlier, they want to have the decisions made, and they may be looking for scholarships, and early action usually like that's when they consider students most for scholarships. On the other hand, I think some students may be thinking like, well, maybe I'll just wait this out, I'll try to take another test score. So I don't know if the numbers are going to go up or down, but I also don't think it's going to make like much of a strategic difference in terms of like early decision, right? Like early decision, there's definitely going to be a strategic advantage, but yeah, early action, not as much advantage. Okay, we have a question from a student. How important will internships be for this cycle, considering many have been canceled? Yeah, it's not just you all. Like so many people's internship programs have been canceled, and that's obviously something that you can't control. If you are doing an internship this summer, consider yourself really lucky. If you're not doing an internship this summer, like you had one but got canceled, just know that like that's not going to be held against you because that's happening to like literally every single kid in the nation. But please try to do something this summer. Like try to do something that makes sense to your profile, right? Like, so for example, are you doing independent research project? If you're interested in humanity, let's say you're a journalism student, can you do some type of your own blog? Like you were supposed to intern for this journalism firm, but now you can't. Can you do something similar instead? Like, can you continue your narrative, even though it's going to require a little bit of shifting to online, a little bit more creativity, but can you do something, you know, on your own from the comforts of your home? Even though it's not an official internship, doing something is better than doing nothing. Other questions or concerns about anything? I'll give people, I'm just gonna stop sharing the slide. I will email the slide out to everybody. I'll give people a few more minutes to think of questions if they have any. But again, the situation's obviously changing. So if things change, we may do another workshop just to keep everyone updated. I think the biggest question mark is just, what's going to happen to the coronavirus itself within the next few weeks or month, and that could change things. Like for example, if there's some speculation, I know even Dr. Fauci has said that we're looking at maybe a second wave in the fall. So there's some speculation that colleges may stay remote again for the fall, just because it may be too big of a health risk, right? So if that really does happen, I think then we're going to really see like deferral rates really impact the junior year class. I just don't know what's going to happen because I don't know what's going to happen with the coronavirus. But as these things become more certain, I will definitely reach out to everyone. So any other questions or concerns from anybody? Okay, let's see. Somebody said, do you think students should apply to more colleges they were originally planning on? I think yes. I think still like 9 to 12 is a really healthy amount. Even though I think more kids are going to be applying to colleges, I don't think applying more than 12 is really in your interest because you really should be prioritizing, the quality of your essays and narrative. But if you're applying to 3 colleges, I would, really advise against applying to just 3. I think 9 to 12 is still the healthy number. Anything less than that probably makes me a little bit nervous, considering, more nervous than I do. Like I would say in most years, anything less than 6 makes me a little bit nervous because that just, but I think this year, even more so, 6 makes me super nervous. So I would still shoot for 9 or 12. Okay. Let me see. I have a few more questions coming in right now. How many deferrals can each college accept? Oh, okay. So at first, I wasn't really sure. I assume you don't mean like deferrals in terms of early action, right? I think you mean like deferrals in terms of like how many seniors will they accept as deferring admissions. This is such a great question because previously, I don't even think that there's a number. Like previously, like this isn't a situation that colleges have ever planned for. They weren't like, oh, like, the majority of our class is going to defer admissions now because of this crazy pandemic. Like nothing like this has ever happened before. So there's never been a number. Like when I worked in admissions, it was never like, oh, we could only accept like 10% or this number of people from deferring enrollment, just because there's never been a even big enough number to even make a difference, right? Like when we make admissions decisions, we know a few people are going to defer their acceptances, and it's never been big enough for it to make a sizable impact anywhere. I don't know if they're going to put a hard number. I don't see how they can fairly do that since the situation is changing rapidly. I do think that if the situation gets worse, like if coronavirus gets worse, this is something that colleges have to decide sooner or later. But I think, again, it really depends on like how deep this gets impacted. If like 50% of classes are getting deferring their enrollment, I mean, that's just insane. Like that would like really, really make things very difficult. I don't think it's gonna be that extreme. I also don't think it's gonna be that extreme when we're talking about like the top tier colleges, because people are gonna go to those colleges regardless. Also, usually in most years, it's the other way around. Like if you've had older students, you'll know that like sometimes in a few years ago, like Cornell was like, we'll give you a $5,000 scholarship if you defer enrollment because they over enrolled. So usually it's like the opposite concern, right? So I really don't know if colleges can even give you a hard number on that. That's something that we're going to be keeping a really close eye on, and it really highly depends on how coronavirus behaves in the next few weeks and months. When do you think schools will announce whether or not they're test optional? Really good question. A lot of schools have already done so. Plenty more have not done so. They're taking a wait and see approach. I think one big thing is going to see if the June ACT will actually take place. Right now, it's supposed to take place. Another big thing is to see how coronavirus behaves this summer. Some people think that's going to get a lot better when the weather gets hotter, right? So it depends on a lot of factors. If it all of a sudden looks like coronavirus is going away, like SARS just randomly went away, right? Or it looks like that ACT and SAT have now been able to take all their tests online, that's going to completely change the landscape as well. So I understand why most colleges are wait and see, even though a number of really prominent schools have come out and said that they're going testing optional. Okay. Somebody said, this is a parent who said, I participated in a virtual tour with admission officers, but I did not follow up. It's been 3 weeks. Should I follow up? You should never be following up as a parent. No, never follow up, because that only makes your student look weaker. That makes it look like they cannot vouch for themselves. So it needs to be the student who follows up. And it also has to be really well thought out, followed up. It can't just be like, oh, I listened to the workshop. Thanks for having it. Just because we really want it to have an impact. Either you do it, it has an impact, or we don't do it at all, because, you know, we don't want to be known as like the kid who just like emails all the time, you know, just to email. Do you think it's likely that most schools will waive subject test requirement? I think that's probably more likely than the general SAT and ACT, but again, a lot of it will depend on what happens with the coronavirus within the next few weeks and months, and how, you know, the testing companies and how the weather changes things. But already a lot of colleges have already come out and said that they're willing to waive SAT requirements, even if they haven't come out for SAT and ACT. Do you think there's a possibility the early action deadline will be changed or postponed? Yeah, I do. I think that there's a real possibility that like ED deadlines will be changed or postponed. The thing about, I mean, this is really difficult because usually I think early action more likely than early decision, because usually with early decision, the value of early decisions that you find out before Christmas, before regular decision deadlines. So, you know, I'm less skeptical of early decision deadlines being changed drastically. They might be changed by a few weeks or so, but I'm more skeptical of it being changed drastically unless regular decision also gets changed. But then that pushes like everything back, right? So I think there's a possibility. More so than any other year. Usually the dates are like really golden any other year. So definitely more chance this year than any other year, but don't bank on it. Like, don't be like, oh, I could just not do my essays this summer and then the deadlines will be pushed back by a month. Like, that's definitely not the go-to strategy. Okay, should I respond to all emails from schools that I'm really interested in, even though these are going to, it seems like everyone? Oh, this is a really good question. So colleges spend a lot of money on marketing, just like any other company. So a lot of students are like, oh, I got an email from this school and that school. And like, you know, and I hate to say this, and sometimes, and I don't want to be the Debbie Downer, but sometimes people are like, oh, I must be really competitive because I got a, you know, email from this school. That's not necessarily true. I mean, I don't know how to put this delicately, but a lot of schools send emails to students who have no chance, because the more kids who apply, the more people get denied, the more that's better for them, right? So I think everyone should be, you know, paying really close attention to emails and opening them no matter what, right? But don't take it as like, oh, this is a guarantee. Like, oh, my Reach school emailed me, now it's a safety school. Definitely not, right? Looking at the email, if it's a group email, like, you know, greetings from this university, I don't think you need to respond. Like, that's just like, you know, you're going to be responding so often, that's going to be meaningless. I don't think you should respond at all. But I think if you got a chance to speak with somebody individually, attend one of their events, like those are things that you should be responding to. And it should be like, well, really well thought out responses, not just like, hey, thank you for doing this event, bye, right? Again, that I wouldn't even respond at that point. Okay. Do you think subject tests may not happen because they have to fill the void with SATs only? Because there's no option to even sign up for any. Yeah, I think there's a good chance, which is why I think, you know, I don't know if every college is going to do this, which is why I think some colleges have at least come out and said, we don't know about SAT and ACT, but we are willing to waive SAT2s. So I think, you know, SAT2s will probably be the first ones to go, and then SAT and ACT. But that's also because SAT2s affect far fewer people. Like, the average kid is not taking SAT2s. It's really the top tier candidates. The average kid applying to college is almost always, this year's a little bit weird, but in any other year, they're almost always taking SATs and ACTs. So if somebody has to, you know, push comes to shove, if somebody has to go, SAT2s are going to go first. If a Reach school emails you, does that indicate that you are an uncompetitive applicant that they're trying to bait? No, that's not what I'm saying. When people email you, they're not like, you know, it's not, that doesn't mean you're competitive or uncompetitive. It just means that their marketing team is doing a good job of emailing people. That's all it means, right? They email competitive candidates just as much as they email uncompetitive candidates. So don't take it as a sign like, oh, my Reach school is emailing me, I'm definitely gonna get in. Just you know, click on the email, read it, open it, or, you know, click on the email, open it, and don't read it. I don't care, but click on the email. Other questions, concerns? Okay. I don't think I see any more questions or concerns, but again, feel free to reach out to me at any time. I know we didn't talk about like any individual situations, so if you do have like an individual situation, please reach out to me so I can answer them. Other than that, since I don't see any other questions, okay, so yeah, I don't see any other questions, so I am going to end this call. Just as like a final announcement, I will be sending out this PowerPoint to everyone so that everybody has like information, including the links that we shared. I will also be reading the full MCPS statement to see if they've clarified what's going to happen with fourth quarter / second semester grades. I haven't read it yet, but I think parents go home and do the same thing. If they still say that it's going to be definitely pass fail, then I would say parents should lobby schools, lobby MCPS to at least give students the option of having grades, because it is going to affect people who've been working really hard junior year to increase their GPA. Okay. All right. Have a good one. Stay safe. Please be in touch with me if you have any personal questions. Bye.